Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Welcome back to World 360, a new show at ThePrint where we explain complex geopolitical issues from regions across the world that don't always hit the headlines. Today, we're going to be looking at one African country in particular, which a lot of people have their eyes on, especially after the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan. Now, this is a war-torn country located on the Horn of Africa, and it's seen several insurgent groups in its history. It's in fact one of the most impoverished nations in the world, where the poverty rate is something like 75%. And if all of these clues didn't help you guess it, today we're going to be talking about Somalia. So a small fun fact before we actually get into this. A Somali-born actor, Barkhad Abdi, was nominated for an Oscar in 2014 after he starred alongside Tom Hanks in a movie about Somali pirates. So, okay, back to why we're actually talking about Somalia. After the fall of Kabul, a lot of African academics, journalists, even the Nigerian President expressed concerns that Somalia could be the next Afghanistan. While in Afghanistan you have the Taliban, in Somalia you have Al-Shabab, which in its latent stages was in fact funded by Osama bin Laden. And since the late 20th century, the UN-backed government in Somalia has been fending off Al-Shabab. Today, Al-Shabab does not have control over the capital, Mogadishu, but it does have control over large swaths of the countryside and rural areas. And it also carries out attacks in the capital. Another part, which we're going to talk about very briefly later on, is the elaborate tax system that Al-Shabaab runs. So here's the main agenda for today. What are the similarities and differences between the Taliban and Al-Shabaab? What is the role of Ethiopia, a majority Christian country that in fact neighbors Somalia? And I noticed that last time a lot of y'all were asking, what about the Indian bilateral relationship when we talk about all these regions? And I'm going to talk about that a little bit in the end, as in, why should Indians care? So first, what is Al-Shabaab? Al-Shabaab is an Islamist militant group which has roots in Al-Ittihad Al-Islamiyah, AIAI, which was formed in Somalia in 1984 with the goal of establishing an Islamic state in East Africa. And the core of this group were Somali extremists who were partly funded by Osama bin Laden. One thing to remember is that between Somalia and Ethiopia is the disputed territory of Ogaden, which is populated by ethnic Somalis. Now, this disputed territory was handed over by the British to Ethiopia in 1948. After a civil war broke out in Somalia in 1991, AIAI teamed up with Ogaden National Liberation Front, which was basically a separatist movement of ethnic Somalis living in Ethiopia's Ogaden region, and they together attacked Ethiopian targets, especially Ethiopian soldiers in Ogaden. Now, in 1996, Ethiopia invaded Somalia and attacked AIAI's strongholds. AIAI eventually broke apart, but some hardliners joined an alliance of Sharia courts known as the Islamic Courts Union, or the ICU. And the armed wing of ICU is what became Al-Shabaab. Now, in 2006, ICU and Al-Shabaab took over Mogadishu, causing US-backed Ethiopian forces to invade Somalia. Ethiopia was successful in driving out the warlords from the capital, and it withdrew formally from the country in 2009, but the nation was still left in tatters. Lots of analysts actually say that this is what ended up radicalizing Al-Shabaab even more. Now, Al-Shabaab has presence in rural areas, and it has shadow governance structures in urban centers. Now, what are the similarities between the Taliban and Al-Shabaab? Kenyan journalist Patrick Gatara has written an interesting op-ed actually in Al Jazeera, which I'll share with you. He talks about how Al-Shabaab, when it was briefly in power, enforced strict Sharia law, just like the Taliban did. They banned music, cinema, sports, and in fact, they stoned to death a woman for alleged adultery. They also amputated the hands of thieves. And so, that sounds pretty familiar given that Taliban recently raised a storm when it announced its plans to resume punishment killings and amputations. So, Al-Shabaab also wants to establish an Islamic state, like Taliban, which has now raised the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. The US has also played a role in both countries to dislodge such terror groups. Also, Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari wrote an op-ed in Financial Times where he pointed out that the lesson for Somalia from the situation in Afghanistan is that you cannot defeat terrorism just by military force. And that can often lead to outcomes that are far dangerous than we would have first envisioned. But of course, there are differences between Taliban and Al-Shabaab, which we're going to talk about right now. Of course, Al-Shabaab is not nearly as well organized as the Taliban. In fact, Omar S. Mahmoud, a senior analyst with the International Crisis Group, and Abdi Hakim Ainte, a former advisor to Somalia's government, they together wrote an op-ed in Foreign Policy, which points out two very important things. One, Al-Shabaab does not have a safe haven outside Somalia, like the Taliban did in Pakistan. Two, Somalia's UN-backed government has a federal system, unlike the Afghan government, which was run by Ashraf Ghani. That was centralized. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Al-Shabaab's fascinating tax collection system, which is mainly done through intimidation and violence. And now, this tax is usually in the form of monthly payments or yearly zakat, which translates to obligatory alms, which is basically when you give 2.5% of your income. Now, a 2020 study by Hiral Institute, which is an African think tank of sorts, found that Al-Shabaab collects more tax than the federal government. There are also Somali government officials and military commanders who don't build their houses in Mogadishu, which remember is the capital, without paying protection money to Al-Shabaab. Now, in rural areas, if you're a farmer, you can't use the river and canals for irrigating your crops unless you pay this tax. And if you're a business in Somalia, you're effectively going to pay tax twice, one to the federal government and another one to Al-Shabaab. Finally, why should India care about this? UN operations in Somalia began in 1992, April 1992, after the Civil War. And the Indian Navy actually played a key role. It was the first Indian naval participation in a UN mission. So what did we do? We patrolled duties off the Somali coast. We transported humanitarian assistance on shore. We also transported men and material for the United Nations. So we did play a crucial role during that very difficult period. Today, a major portion of India's maritime trade passes through the Gulf of Aden along the coast of Somalia. And the Indian Navy also carries out elaborate anti-piracy patrols off this coast. So all in all, Somalia is a major maritime neighbor for us. And recently you would have heard that PM Modi at the UNGA spoke about India's commitment to fighting extremism and terrorism across the world. And this is actually a region that we should be paying extreme attention to as well and keep our eye on. For The Print, this is Pia Krishankutty. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode today. We'll be back soon.